Welcome to the Predictable Revenue Podcast, where sales leaders teach you what's working for them so you can build it yourself. Feeling ready to kick your sales into high gear? We're here to help. Check out our sales coaching and consulting services at predictablerevenue.com. Welcome back to the Predictable Revenue Podcast. I'm your host, Collin Stewart. Today, I'm joined by Belal Batrawy, the founder of Learn to Sell and Death to Fluff. Belal, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me. It's an honor always to be on the show, be talking to you. I appreciate it, man.
I feel in my head you were like one of our first guests. You were probably like guest 50 or something along those lines. But like it's been a long time, you know. And there's a few that stand out. And I definitely remember having you on the show. And I followed you on LinkedIn. And you got a ton of followers. You get some great content there. So I'm really excited to have you back on. And for those listening, we're going to talk about how to nail your core messaging. So Belal, welcome back. I'm super pumped to have you here.
Yeah, man, I appreciate it. It was a memorable episode. It was one of my first big podcasts when I started posting that you guys invited me. So I'd never forget it. Yeah, I never forget it. I'm like, yeah, I made it, Mom. I made it. Look at me. I'm on a podcast.
That's so cool. It's so cool when I go to somebody's like an old podcast guest's LinkedIn profile and like the first thing that is posted is like one of the links is like the podcast that we did together 5 years ago. I'm like, that's so cool. That's neat. At least they've listened to it, you know?
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, and I want to take a small detour because back when we were doing we did the first episode, you were working for the man. Now you're working for yourself. We're going to talk a little bit about what you're doing at the end. And we've got some interesting stuff to talk about at the boot camp. But tell me what is the difference between Death to Fluff and Learn to Sell?
Yeah, that's a great question. Death to Fluff is like the personal calling of mine. It started off as an inside joke when I started posting, and then I hashtagged it as just continuing the joke. And then next thing you know, I saw other people hashtagging it, and I'm like, oh, this is a thing. And people were like following the hashtag, and I'm like, what? Why are you following the hashtag? And so it kind of became like a little movement of its own. For a lot of people, it means different things, but the premise is pretty easy to understand. No fluff, you know, there's too much of it, whether it comes from bad sales advice to bad practices to, you know, toxic work environments or whatever it might be. And so that's where that started off. And now that I'm on my own, I didn't want to sell just directly through Death to Fluff. I realized that in order to potentially invite others to the project and work with more people, I didn't want to give away my own personal brand. So I learned to sell.io was born as a more neutral platform, but I'm still Mr. Death to Fluff.
Love it. It's so appropriate because we're going to talk about core messaging today. So why is messaging so important? Why is it so key to make sure that everybody's saying the same thing?
Yeah, well, I mean, for buyers and anybody that's bought anything just in recent times, you know how complicated it is. It's just so noisy to try to filter everything. So, you know, your messaging is going to be how people put you in the right place and contextualize what it is you're trying to do. And if you've got either your team spitting it out wrong, or you've got, you know, mixed messaging across your sales funnel and your marketing funnels and things like that, it's a disaster. Like it really is a disaster because how are people going to find you and understand what it is you do if it's all masked and muddled? You know, it's just, you got to get it right.
Totally. Well, and then there's the variability of if you don't give people core messaging, you let your SDRs, your most junior AEs dictate the words that your customers, your prospects hear first, which that's just a big old slot machine. And I don't like to gamble.
It's the worst. Yeah, it really is. It believe it or not, deals are lost just on messaging for sure. Before anything else happens, the buyer's just trying to place it in their head. They place it somewhere wrong, and that's it. They're just like, okay, not a priority. Don't need to worry about this. Sounds cool, but thank you very much.
If you're sitting here listening going, yeah, we do this or we don't do this. And what I want you to think about is like, picture the most recent salesperson you just hired, right? They could be a week into their onboarding. They could be a month. They could be 6 months in. Compared to you, how good are they at explaining crisply and precisely what your company does? And if you think there's a little bit of variability in there, if you think there's a lot of variability in there, this episode's for you. So I want to know, how do you think about messaging and kind of pulling it all together?
So I like to work off the messaging pyramid. People maybe have seen this before. Of is, does, mean. So imagine a pyramid, and it's broken into 3 sections. At the bottom of it is the word is, in the middle is the word does, and at the top of it is the word means. Okay, so take something simple like a Snickers bar. What is it? It's a chocolate bar. Okay, what does it do? It fills you up. It's got the peanuts, the nougat, all that good stuff in there. It's a fatty's delight. But what does it mean, right? When they do a Snickers ad, they don't say, eat our delicious chocolate bar. They say, you're not you when you're hungry. You know, there are going to be times when you are out with friends or doing something and you can't have a meal, but you are acting hangry. So grab a Snickers. And then on their chocolate bar, it says satisfies. Just one word. It satisfies your hunger. So they have figured out the jobs to be done of their chocolate bar. And that's how they message. And now we all have that locked in our heads. We know what Snickers is, what it does, what it's for. And so you have to do the same thing with B2B messaging. And if you think it's hard to come up with B2B messaging for that, it's a lot harder, trust me, to come up with the jobs to be done of milk or a Snickers bar or like a peanut butter. It's actually a lot easier than you think to do it for B2B. We just don't, unfortunately, do this exercise often.
Can I sidebar on something for a sec? Have you seen Clayton Christensen's milkshake video?
No, I haven't. Tell me about it.
Dude, he talks about the job to be done of a milkshake. Okay. And it is very similar to what you're talking about with the Snickers example, but it's Clayton Christensen, the Innovator's Dilemma author. It's fantastic. Anytime somebody says job to be done, I'm like, you got to watch this video. It's about a 7-minute. I think it was like, I'll find a link to it. I'll throw it in the show notes and I'll send it to you because it's fantastic. You'll never look at a milkshake again. It is the same way again. It's hilarious. Anyway, so you get down to the job to be done. So is that the is that the does, is that the means?
That's the means. And everybody does really well with is. If you look at most messaging that you see on websites and stuff, it's what the product is. We are this, we do that. So it's is, sometimes does, very rarely is it what it means. And so your buyer's still struggling to be like, so what do I do with this thing? So what is it actually going to do for me? And that's that top level. And the reason why it's so hard to get to that point is because your buyers don't have a universal language. It's not their job to explain their problems clearly and succinctly. So you end up with these half translations, or even worse, sometimes using the words of your customers to explain your product to your buyers, but buyers are not customers. They're at a very different stage of the buyer's journey. So it doesn't translate well. So you have to become the universal translator of all this stuff. And again, most people fail at doing this. They just don't realize they're either throwing customer quotes at a buyer and it's not resonating, or they're stuck in is and does, and they're not realizing, they're not explaining what it means. What's the point?
So how do we go from, if I'm sitting there, if I'm listening, I'm an AE, I got to do this myself. I'm a sales leader. I'm doing this for the first time. Do I just sit down with a blank document and go is, does, means, and then just kind of write whatever comes to mind? Like, how do I go from nothing to a really good answer?
Yeah. So the first starting point is definitely write what it is and what it does. You'll find when you get to means, you'll just stare at that page blankly. It won't happen. It really won't. You'll be like, so where do I go from here? Is and does are super easy. What is your product? Just explain to you. What is it? What is Tylenol? It's acetaminophen. Okay, great. We're good. And what does it do? It helps you with, if you've got joint pains or a headache. Cool. What does it mean? All of a sudden you're like, well, I don't know where to go. Where do I go with means? Well, the means is always tied to the buyer persona. So that's why it starts to get, because is and does is the product. And then when we jump to means, there's a subtle shift that just occurred. All of a sudden, the focus of means, what your product means, is no longer about your product per se. It's related to the buyer persona. So Tylenol ads will have like a mother in the middle of the afternoon rubbing her template, and it's like no color on the screen. Then she pops the Tylenol. Next thing you know, she's outside with her kids in the garden playing. And it's like, that's what Tylenol means. Or, a construction worker rubbing their joints, and then they pop a Tylenol, all of a sudden they can get the rest of the day done. So you have to now all of a sudden do a shift from is and does, which was all related to you and your company and your product. Easy, right? Easy to talk about ourselves. And all of a sudden we got to do this shift to be like, well, who is the means about? Meaning like who is that person? Who is that person we're talking about and what it means to them? It has to mean something to a person, and that's your buyer persona. And if you don't have your buyer persona nailed, you don't know who your audience is. Now all of a sudden you can't do means messaging, can you? So that becomes the first step. Who's the buyer and what's going on and what's their situation? And all of a sudden you're no longer on that page trying to fill out means. You have a new page set up and you're filling out some very hopefully intimate details about what's going on in your buyer's world.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And so it starts with the buyer, and then you kind of connect it is, does, means. I imagine, because we've done this before, but I don't want to talk about us. I want to talk about you. How do you go from multiple buyer personas to is, does, means? Is it all one is, does, mean, or do you have 1,000 different versions?
No, you should have one in the end that's the one that's going to resonate the strongest. And typically somewhere in the process of building out these buyer personas, we always know that they're not equal. So there's going to be one or two that are far more valuable than the other 3 or 4, even though they might all exist. And once you've got that priority down, there's typically some sort of an emotional theme, a trigger that you're going to center around. Even though it might be a different persona, the problem or the pain or the issue might be the same. That inherent feeling that they've got. Like, for example, in the Snickers bar, we said, you're hangry. Like, it doesn't matter whether you're male or female, old or young, here or there. We all know what it's like to feel super hungry, and that hungry is making us feel angry, right? Doesn't matter your persona. So they could do that ad to Gen Z, and they could do that ad to boomers, and it's going to still be effective because the emotional trigger is the same. Mm-hmm. In the same way with that Tylenol ad, even though the imagery is different, but that feeling blocked of not being able to do what you need to do because your head is pounding. We've all felt that. We've all had a headache. So that's what it comes down to. And once you've identified the personas, there's some sort of priority ranking you're going to do. You're going to trash a few and put them second or third. You're going to have 1 or 2 probably that come out as the top most important, most valuable. And now it's like, so what's the emotional thread that connects these 2 buyers? What's the inherent problem that's going to, trigger the limbic brain and make them get emotional? Because that's what we want. We want an emotional reaction to the messaging. We want them to feel it.
I've heard you describe as your messaging as polarizing. How do you go from a job to be done and finding that element that's polarizing?
Yeah. So polarizing is the idea that I want to create a message that causes people to choose a side, that causes a fork in the road. That's not just easy to ignore. There's going to be a set of people that vehemently disagree with my message, and there's going to be another set that absolutely agree with it. And I'm okay. And I want both, because polarizing is the ability to, again, attract the right audience and push away the wrong. And you see this, for example, again, it's all over B2C where, you'll have a brand that positions itself with a certain type of buyer. And so you're no longer attracted to it if you're not that audience that they're looking for. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. And we spend too much time in B2B trying to sell to people that aren't legitimate buyers. They're just prospects, or they're part of a larger target audience, but they're not your true core buyers that are going to love your product, tell everybody about it, and never argue with you about the price. Even though they might not be your highest paying customers, they're your best. Because typically in B2B and SaaS in general, the real value comes from lifetime value of a customer, not the initial purchase, and the ability to kind of, sell them more of the product as they consume it. So what you're trying to do is find that emotional trigger, okay? And you're trying to connect the buyer personas to some sort of emotional trigger, and that what's going to make it emotional, the key, the recipe, the secret sauce in the recipe is going to be it being provocative. It's not a message that everybody's going to agree with. And I can give some examples of how this looks like, but you really do have to kind of pick an enemy and realize that people are not going to agree with what you pick with. You're just not going to win everyone over. And that's the point. The point is, don't play it safe. Don't go with that safe, soft message that, it's sort of like the world is changing. Okay, but that's not provocative. Yes, that might be a viewpoint that your buyer shares, but is it provocative? Changing to what? And how serious is that shift? Like, let's pick an enemy and get specific here and not play it safe.
Death to fluff. Love it. There are probably some marketing folks that might feel targeted there, but I think that's a great one because it's something that resonates with everybody, right? There's nobody that wants to put out a fluff piece or a fluffy messaging. What are some other examples of really strong polarizing messaging?
Yeah, so like I'll give you an example. At Full Story, we had a really good polarizing message, which was the idea that, everybody that we spoke to was familiar with the idea of like website analytics. But what we were doing at Full Story was different. We were doing session replay. You could actually watch the sessions being recorded. And
dude, it was crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
I used it when they were in beta, and I still remember the demo, and I was like, what? They're like, put this pixel on your site.
Is it legal?
I was like, what is happening? It was like you could see the user moving the mouse. Like that was bananas. Yeah.
Like you're standing over their shoulder. And that was the initial messaging, right? It was like, see your users as if over their shoulder. And it was just like, but that's not polarizing, right? That's not provocative. There's nothing in that that's really spicy that's going to, again, emotionally trigger me as a buyer. So what we changed it to was, we used to tell people, okay, have you ever been on a website where you found it so frustrating you started slamming your mouse, just clicking all over the screen, being like, why is it not doing what I want? Okay. Well, we call that a rage click. And the question we have for you is, how do you know if people are rage clicking on your product or website right now? Okay. So now all of a sudden we've capitalized on what is a really relatable experience. Being on a crummy website with bad UI and you are slamming your mouse. And we had some people didn't do rage clicks. They would do they just wave their cursor all over the place. So we had a name for that too. But, we kind of named this feeling, this angry feeling that you get. And then the question becomes, what if people are doing that right now on your stuff? How would you know? And now all of a sudden you got me thinking. Now that's succinct, tight, says nothing about Full Story yet, right? We haven't talked about the product. We haven't talked about what it is or what it does. We talked about what it means. The ability to see when people are pissed on your product is what Full Story gives you. And so that's emotionally charged. Now there's a whole camp of people that be like, I don't think I need that. Why does that matter? There's a whole camp of people that be like, no, I don't think that's important. That's okay. Because again, we're not trying to win everyone, but the core people that bought Full Story, those product marketers and product managers and engineers and so on, that were just like, yes, give me that. Give me that ability. I need that. I care about that.
It pulls the right people into the sales process and kind of keeps away the tire kickers.
That's right. That's right. I'll give another example so people can get the idea of this. So one of the startups that was called Connectifier, and this was before we had GDPR and stuff. So they would open source everybody's contact information that was available on the public web and create kind of a super profile of that individual. And so we would sell this to recruiters, and most recruiters use LinkedIn. So what we would say is LinkedIn is a closed garden. LinkedIn's information only relies on LinkedIn itself. It pulls nothing from the web. In fact, it wants nothing to do with the rest of the internet. And we feel that that's a mistake. There's so much more information on a person than just what's on LinkedIn. Think about Twitter, think about, GitHub, think about all the social media sites that are out there. Imagine you could pull in all this information instead of just relying on one source that may or may not be even, updated. Mm-hmm. Now, there again, polarizing. There's a set of people who are like, how dare you? Like LinkedIn is life. What are you talking about? And there's a whole other group be like, wait a second. Yeah, you're right. I mean, why am I relying on one source? So if you're telling me I can have 10, 15 at my disposal without additional work, it's just available to me. Why wouldn't I take more? And so it was polarizing. And again, we knew our buyer. We knew, and again, that's not talking about what Connectifier is or what it does, what it means. It means you get more info at your fingertips without necessarily having to do more work.
I want to pull us into the tactical for a minute because you shared your discussion board in our pre-interview, and I really like that. And so can you walk me through how the discussion board how you bring that into the process?
Yeah. So there is the process to it. So it's not like haphazard. We want to, there's some social psychology here of what we're trying to do when you do really good messaging. So part of it is keeping in mind that people judge a message based on who's saying it more than they judge what the message is. Okay? And this is just proven in social psychology. There's a number of studies that date back even to like the 60s that talk about the source of information is more important than the information itself. So if I love Elon Musk and he says something, I'm going to believe him regardless of what the credibility of what he said, because it's Elon Musk saying it and that's my guy. Or the opposite.
Right.
It's not my guy, so I don't care what he says. He's wrong. That kind of an approach. Okay. So what you want to do with great messaging is establish some form of credibility. Okay. Establish some sort of credibility with your audience. There's a number of ways to do that. Sometimes that could be, with industry awards. Sometimes that could be with incredible background or experience. Sometimes that could be even with just explaining their problem better than they themselves can explain it. That's a great way to get credibility. If you could talk about my world better than I myself can say, because again, we said our buyers don't have a universal language to explain their problems. Now you've got my attention because clearly you know something about it. Okay. So there's different ways that we can establish credibility. Credibility doesn't take long to happen. It's a snap judgment that people are going to make about you, and then trust is something that happens over time. We sometimes talk about trust and credibility as the same thing. Trust takes time. Credibility is a snap judgment people are going to make. So we want to establish some kind of credibility. And so normally on a discussion board or some sort of a demo deck, I would have my first slide just talking about why you need to listen to us. Like, we're not amateurs. This isn't some joke. It might be the logo wall. People hate on the logo wall nowadays, but it's like, no, that's valuable, because if I see a logo on there that I respect or recognize, that gives you credibility now as you're about to deliver the next part, which is some sort of a world problem, or like what I like to say, a world view or a market insight. This idea again of like rage clicks, they're happening. Are you paying attention to them? Or this idea again, you've been living in a closed garden and you're leaving a bunch of information out there that you should have. There's some sort of world view that we want to talk about, some sort of thing that's happening that is going to impact your buyer in doing their job. And they have to pick a side. Are you with me on this worldview? Are you with me that this is legit or not? And either way, there's no right or wrong answer, but you got to pick a lane. Mm-hmm. You got to pick a side. And that's what makes it provocative. That's what makes it emotional. That's what causes the trigger. And again, it's kind of polarized. It's magnetic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then from that point, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, let's actually pause there, because I want to see if you got any questions on that. I imagine your listeners do.
Yeah, I mean, I think about the worldview. It's such an important piece. I remember I can't remember. I wish I could remember who it was, but a podcast guest said to me, like, if you're trying to write messaging for everybody, you're actually writing messaging for nobody. And that stuck to me. And then somebody else said, imagine you're a tourist in a new city, right? Say you go to Rome, right? You can go to and you only have a couple hours. You can go to, the Colosseum, or you can go to, the cathedrals or the cathedral. They're on opposite sides of the city. You can only be in one place this afternoon. Where are you going to be, right? You can't be in every place. And it's the same with your messaging. You can only lead with one core point. You can only lead with one key idea. You can't be at both places at the same time.
You cannot. And this is why I attack oftentimes the idea of the pain menu, which is the lazy way to try to approach this. So people come up with some sort of pain menu of like, a lot of the people I speak to have problems with A, B, and C. Which one of those is something you're thinking about now? It's like, no, that's lazy. Okay. Mm-hmm. You don't ask me to like select on the menu for you what the problem is. You should know that. That's, again, part of the research that you would do. So a lot of this worldview stuff oftentimes starts with me looking at job descriptions. I will pull 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 job descriptions of the exact person I want to sell to. Like, when that position is filled, that's the person I want to meet with.
Yeah.
And let me look at the common language. Let me look at what is expected of them. And let me start to derive from that job description some of the problems I'd imagine that they face. And let me find one that's going to be, again, emotionally triggering. One that's going to be, again, polarizing. That's going to be making them feel something, anger, anxiety, pain, something. I'm going to get an emotional reaction from them. And now I want to build a story around that. So this is the kind of the story building part of like, what's the worldview? What's the issue? And now that you have that and you've got some sort of worldview, oftentimes people make the mistake of then jumping to, well, here's how we solve that, right? Here, okay, you've accepted the worldview. Now we're going to just jump to like solution. And it's like, no, not yet. We got to marinate a little bit before we just jump into that. The next part of it has to be, why is that happening? And what does it take to be on the right side of that worldview? Or what does it take to be overcoming that market insight, whatever it's going to be? So we need some why in there. Why is this happening? Why is it now? Why should I care? Yes, okay, I agree to the worldview, but why now? And then what does it take? What are the stakes essentially? Are there stakes? And this is kind of I really like how Andy Raskin describes it, of like stakes in the game. You know, there has to be stakes. You know, is this life or death? Is this more like, okay, summer day versus, a little bit of a sunburn? Like, what are the stakes here? Give me an idea of like, so that's up to you. You get to craft that narrative. And that's going to influence massively how your buyer thinks, because that's what they're looking for. Again, they're not coming in ready to explain their problems. We have to kind of plant some seeds in there and essentially shape the way that they're thinking about things that are not their core responsibility. They have a whole host of things going on in their world. And so we're picking out one and we're saying, this is the one. This is the one you need to have your eyes on.
It narrows the focus of the buyer.
Yeah.
Every kind of step of the way, you're just, the goal is to, if we're going to continue the conversation, it's obvious that this is the pain. And so we talk about establishing, you talk about establishing credibility, the worldview, sharing why this is happening now, the stakes. What's the next piece of that discussion board?
So the final piece then is now we want to kind of tease the answer. Okay. I'm going to say, well, what if you could blank? All right. Like, and the way I try to explain this to sellers, because they always make this mistake, is they position themselves and the product as the hero. And that's what we want. We want the buyer to feel like they're the hero. And you're simply giving them the magic sword to slay the dragon, right? Let the buyer be the knight in shining armor. You're going to be Merlin. You're giving them the magic sword. Now that's hard to do if you're not premeditated about it. If you're not thinking about that from the moment you start writing your messaging, you're not going to, after the fact, go back and be like, oh, let me just change this word, and that makes them the hero versus us. Again, because is and does is all about the company, means messaging is supposed to be about them. That's the subtle shift that happens at the top of that triangle. That's what makes it so hard to write it. And what you said in the beginning of when we were talking about, if I just took a blank page, will I fill it out? You won't. You'll get to means and be like, oh my God, what now? Well, so we got our buyer persona, and now we're doing this deck, and we're talking about this worldview that's going to be polarizing. Let's tease the promised land. Let's not just be like, we solve that for you. That's us being the hero. Well, what if you could do this? So in the case of Connect, so what if you could pull up a profile on LinkedIn, but get all the other social channels of that person immediately, instantly, next to you, automatically? What would that do? Does that solve the answer of what you're thinking about a closed garden versus the open garden of not being limited to one source? In the case of Full Story, I was like, well, what if we recorded everything on the website and it was as simple as a Google search to find everybody that rage clicked? You would just simply say, show me everybody who rage clicked in the last week. And it would just pull up all those sessions. What if that was possible? So now you're starting to address the problem.
Totally. And could you, just to help me see the board, can you walk me through the Full Stories whole discussion board?
Yeah.
Let me establish credibility to tease the answer.
Let me show you right here. Yep. So this was the original one. You can see it's not a lot of slides. We don't need a lot of time to get through all of this. We can do it pretty succinctly. So here's the credibility part. We're a team of ex-Googlers backed by Google Ventures. Look at all of our logos. And I probably said Google like 15 times on this slide because, again, I'm trying to tie something that they find credible to us as a little tiny startup that had no brand, no inbound, no marketing, nothing, right? But we're not a bunch of randos here. We've done some stuff, okay? So now we've got some credibility established, and then we would say, well, we asked ourselves a simple question. The most visited website on the planet is Google search, and it has no help, desk. It has no chat support. It has no FAQ. People just know how to use it. Whether you're a grandma or a kid, you know what to do because Google indexed the entire internet for us. What if we could do the same thing for what's happening on your website? What if we can index all those interactions? So we did, right? We capture everything with one snippet. And it doesn't slow down your website in any way. And we do this for a lot of folks. And now the possibility becomes you're thinking today, hey, how do I use this to improve some feature on my website? Eventually, you're going to see somebody struggling. You're going to send that to an engineering team. And they're going to go, whoa, this is incredible. Where did this come from? I don't have to ask for a screenshot and play 21 questions to get everything I need to solve that. I can see exactly what's going on. And next thing you know, your entire company starts using this tool, putting the customer experience at the heart of what they do. So this is 4 slides, and we've done it. We've established credibility. We set some kind of big worldview. And then we said, well, the issue why you can't solve it is because you have to capture everything. That's what we took on as an engineering challenge. And if you could capture everything, it unlocks this new reality.
Love that. And so when you go from now this, if you're not watching on YouTube, he was sharing a screen for a minute, and I'll throw a screenshot in the show notes. So if you want to take a look at that, you can go have a look at the screen in the show notes. Pardon me. Where does this live, right? Like if say we've gone through this process, we have created our discussion board, we have mapped it out. Is this a slide deck? Is this how I encourage my salespeople to present, my company? Where does this live? How do we make use of it?
But that's a question. The reason why I call it a discussion board versus a demo deck is that I genuinely believe this is the thing you use on the first meeting with that potential buyer. This is how you start the conversation with them. Hey, I'd like to get your opinion on something, Collin. You mind if I share something real quick? Sure. Yeah, let's do it. And I'm going to pull this out. So just so you know, a little bit about background to us. Again, establish some credibility real fast. Don't have to spend too long on that. Then get straight into that, that worldview and see if it resonates with you or not. And so it's really the first impression. It's that first meaningful discussion. And I'm going to try to shape the conversation that we're going to have going forward if it ends up moving forward from that point, because I've already started planting seeds and giving you some things to think about. This is very different than what you would see in a traditional sales where they're just running right into discovery. And, it's an interrogation and they're trying to figure out everything about it. It's like, no. I already have some opinions. I've done my research. I understand you as a buyer. And I think I have something that you're going to fancy. And odds are, if you don't fancy what I'm about to show you, you're probably not a buyer then. And that's okay. But I need to know that now before we go further, before we're 3, 4, 5 meetings into the sales process. And I realize, wait, this is going nowhere.
And I think if we sidebar on this, because if regular listeners will probably point out that, all right, Collin always says the opposite. I hate it when people, especially salespeople, whip a deck out. And they're like, hey, let me show you some things. Because it never usually goes well. Even in this case, part of me was still like, oh, I don't love that. Because you're getting a slide deck to do the thing. That's more of a style choice, I think, than this, because that obviously does frame the conversation really nicely. But I think there's no right or wrong answer here. It is, what does your sales process need? In the case of Full Story, they're competing against Google Analytics, companies like Mixpanel, Kissmetrics, those kinds of things. It is a very different solution. And so the way you've engineered the sales process is to intentionally filter in only the people that are going to go quite a bit deeper, because the space you live in is this wide. And so you're starting the conversation with, hey, this is the thing, to let all those other people self-select out. That's the right decision for Full Story. For another company, it may be quite the opposite. Like if you come and you inbound to predictable revenue, we're going to go wide and we're going to have that discovery conversation, because people can present with a number of different issues. And it's sometimes you have to cycle through a few things. But our solution and full story solution are two dramatically different spectrums and should have a different sales process.
And I'll say this. I'd imagine you've not seen a sales deck that looked like this one before. I'd imagine you've seen the like 20 slide type things that are much more, if you notice, nowhere in the discussion that I mentioned what full story actually will do, how it's going to work. Any of those sort of details have been completely skipped. I never mentioned a single feature yet, anything of that sort. All of that stuff is left for later, because if the worldview isn't accepted, then there's no reason to go into that, right? I got nothing to show you. I don't have the magical sword you're looking for to slay that dragon. You're not fighting the same dragon that the people who come to me fight. So good luck. I don't know who you need, but it's not me. I'm not the merchant you're looking for. And that's okay. So that's why I really challenge sellers to do that early in the first discussion, because I could do discovery later. Discovery's ongoing in a sense anyways. It never ends per se. And every time a new person's brought into the deal, discovery can sometimes even have to reset
100%,
depending on the seniority of that person. So, but that worldview, we got to lock that in, because if they're not on the same page and they don't see it the way that I do, I need to know that real quick. There's no reason to keep going and think that your features and functionality and all that sort of stuff is going to just magically win them over. That's not how people buy. That's not how it works. The brain science is pretty conclusive. We are emotional first, and then we rationale second. And if you can't get that emotional buy-in, it's just not going to work. And again, B2C brands are doing this, and they're doing it so well. They're doing it so effectively. So again, if they can figure out the jobs to be done of a chocolate bar or a milkshake, then by God, we could do it. Like, we could figure it out for our services and our products.
100%. There's one thing to come up with the core messaging in theory, right? You can go through the process, you can listen to this episode and go, okay, cool. I've sat down there in my little walled garden and I said, okay, I'm going to do this myself. It's another thing to roll it out and make sure everybody in the sales team is aligned. How do you go about doing that? You say, hey, here's the deck, go for it. Like, what's your process?
Well, I'll tell you right now, salespeople are going to be much more willing to try this as they see the conversation quality go up. And that's how you know you've got the right discussion board. So typically what I've done, what I shared right now was the final version. I didn't just show, that's like VSAT. I was like, well, what about V1, 2, 3? Well, 1, 2, 3, we're trying different things. You're not going to nail that on the first pass. It's an impossible expectation to have. So you might want to play around with a couple worldviews and try them out. And you're going to see which one resonates really quickly and which one doesn't. Oftentimes, the first worldview you come up with is not polarizing enough, is not specific enough. It's a little bit too generic. And that's partly because of the ignorance we have of our buyer's world. We didn't go deep enough into what's going on. And through multiple discussions, you're going to refine it really quickly. Oftentimes, it's going to be that moment where you say a message and a seller recognizes the body language changes in the buyer. They all of a sudden rub their head and go, oh my God, wow. And you're like, wait, what made them do that? Like, what made them react physically to what I just said? And whenever I've done this, Collin, all the successful discussion boards that we've built, that's the reaction we get. At the end, the final version, right? V1 didn't quite get it, but by the time we're at V6, V7, whatever it is, we're getting that kind of physical. They get out of their chair and they shift around. They're rubbing their head. They lean in and they're like, wow, you said that better than even I could. It's like, yeah, I know, because I've been trying to now for months. That was the whole point. So that's when you show that to a seller, whether it's an SDR or an AE, you say, look, I can show you a method that's going to get a physical reaction from your buyer, because you're going to say the problem better than they themselves can, and they're going to lean in. That's you're going to get a ton of buy-in that way. You are. So you give them the board, you give them a bit of a talk track, give them some guidance on how they should do it. And I highly recommend, as founders, doing it yourselves. You got to get your hands dirty and try it out and find out which worldview of a couple that you might select would be the right one, and how to dig that knife deep on the next part, which is what are the stakes? What's the why behind that worldview? But once you got it right, it's really easy to get everyone else to fall in line. And the beauty of it is this: what ends up as a byproduct of that discussion board is the means messaging. And oftentimes that's what shows up on the hero page of a website. That's the part you want is, like at Full Story, we talked for a long time on the website about rage clicks. That was the leading theme. We had all the features and functionality on the planet. We didn't lead with any of them. We just said, you have to understand your user's behavior. You can't win in this competitive environment unless you understand your user's behavior, and people are rage clicking on your website right now. And eventually rage click became an industry term. Like our competitors kind of stole it. That's how effective it was as a message. So, this stuff translates across sales and marketing once you get that conversation right, once you get that worldview correct.
I love that. And so it seems it's an iterative process, that it's not just one individual, it's everybody. It's the fact that Full Story took 7 different iterations to get there. And once you've gotten to that higher ground, your salespeople are going to pull this into their lives because they've been testing and they've been involved in the iteration cycles, and they're going to recognize that this messaging is going to help them earn more commission.
Yeah. Well, they're going to see that, again, the quality of the conversation is going to change completely. When you do it right, the buyer, the interaction is so much better. Because again, they're seeing credibility in that seller. They're seeing, high relevancy to their world. And more importantly, it's giving them a feeling that they're learning. Like I oftentimes would have buyers say something to the effect of like, we've talked about that before, but never the way you said it. It's like the way you said it summarized all those conversations. I'm like, we got it. Like, yes, we got it, fam. Like, that's exactly what we were looking for. We were in their heads. We were in their internal meetings. We were capturing their words just in a way that, again, they didn't have the language to express because it's not their job to. Because they weren't sitting all day being like, how do I explain this problem better? That's not their job. They had their other things going on.
I mean, chances are, if they're buying something, it could be their first time experiencing this problem. It could be their first time trying to solve it. Even if it's their third time and they've done this at 3 different companies or two other companies, and this is their third time, they still have only done it 3 times. Whereas you as a seller, you as somebody in that sales leadership role, you've helped hundreds or thousands of companies. And so you as a seller, you as a sales organization, you as an organization, you are experts in this particular problem space because this is where you live. So you should be able to communicate it exceptionally clearly. You're that Sherpa on their kind of journey to climb the mountain of the job to be done and make that progress.
Yep.
Belal, I really appreciate you coming back on the show. It's been really fun to get to see you again, to catch up on what you've been working on. The thing that has got me most interested is the boot camp. Tell me about these boot camps. Tell me about for sales teams. I'm really curious.
I appreciate it. So we do I do a boot camp every month where I take sellers through this journey of building their own discussion board and learning a few advanced social psychology techniques on how to do discovery that aren't taught in traditional sales training. And I think a lot of sellers can understand the idea of kind of having their skills plateau. You reach a certain point as a seller where, there's no book or video or article that's going to teach you something new anymore. You've kind of heard everything or understood some of the basic concepts, but you're nowhere near mastery yet. So how do you get to that next level? Typically, you want to get to that next level through somebody who's been there already. And I was fortunate enough to have some very elite sellers that I work with that mentored me, that showed me some things that my sales training did not, that were very effective for me. And so I teach those in the boot camp. So it's not for junior reps. I wouldn't recommend it for them, but for reps that are, have a couple of years experience and are looking out for the next thing, that more advanced, I call it beyond the basics. This is the beyond the basics stuff where now we get into more technical things, away from the baby stuff of like setting an agenda at the beginning of the meeting and now getting into the real, how do we actually have a meaningful conversation with this buyer? And are there some social psychology techniques that we can be using to create that?
I love that. If people are curious about that, where's the best place for them to learn more?
LearnToSell.io. That's where I as I launch these boot camps, You'll see it posted on there. If you want to get early access and know about boot camps in advance, I always tell my newsletter that. So it's just deathtofluff.substack.com. So if you but if you go to learntosell.io, the next boot camp will typically be up there as well.
Right on. Belal, thank you so much for coming back on the show. It was great to catch up. And thanks to everybody for listening. We'll catch y'all next week.